has only one round. Each speaker will be given 20 minutes to present. After our 3 speakers have completed their presentations, there will be a Q&A session for 15 minutes. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Billy A. Renandaya. He is a language teacher educator with extensive teaching experience in Asia. He currently teaches applied linguistics courses at the National Institute of Education, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. He has given more than 100 keynote presentations at international ELT conferences and published extensively in the area of second language education. Dr. Billy A. Renanya will be sharing with us on the topic, learning to unlearn faulty beliefs and practices. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our first speaker. Over to you, Dr. Billy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. It's always good to spend a Saturday afternoon with a lot of people in the audience, good friends from Korea, from Malaysia, from Hong Kong, and from many, many other places. Always gives me a great pleasure to be around friends, especially very good friends. From Korea, Ji Hyun Jeon, former president, Joo Kyung Park, Aslam Khan, Keo Young Lee, and also former president, the founder of AsiaTEFL, Professor Lee. Greeting to you. Ladies and gentlemen, today I'm going to share with you a very interesting topic, but at the same time, it's a little bit tricky because I'm going to spend time discussing with you some of the beliefs and practices in ELT, which to me is problematic. So I'm going to share with you why these are problematic and how we can, go about thinking about how we can, adopt new beliefs and new practices in English language teaching. And that requires that we need to make a lot of changes to the way we do things, to the way we think about English language teaching, and also to how we approach the teaching of language in our classroom. Let me start with the most important takeaway of today's session. I think we need to look at our beliefs and practices very carefully, very critically as well, and also be willing to throw away those that are no longer useful. In other words, I'm going to invite us to think about this issue very carefully so that we can take the first step to making important changes in our practices, in the way we teach language to our students, whether in high school or whether at the university level. Change is hard at first. It's messy in the middle, but it's wonderful towards the end. Let me share with you what I have seen very often being reported in the newspapers about students who continue to struggle in their process of learning English, either in school or in colleges. You can fill in the name of the country. You can apply to your country, to my country, to anyone's country. But what all these countries have in common is that there's quite a bit of a concern that what we have done is not, bearing fruit, in the sense that we have not been able to get our students to improve their level of proficiency. And because of that, there is, there are ways, there are things that governments have been doing in order to, upgrade the English language skills of the students and also of the teachers. In other words, we are facing the same classic problem of low proficiency among many of our students. Malaysia, Thailand, many other places, including Singapore as well. But the response from stakeholders, from policymakers, from government officials, and sometimes from us as well is very interesting. Now, here are some of the responses that I often see, which I'm going to share with you. Please nod your head if you agree. Number one, hey, one of the problems is because we start late, so maybe we should start teaching English at a very young level. at the kindergarten level, or maybe even before the babies are born. Number two, hey, maybe we should invite more native speakers because they can do, a better job. Or my favorite is this one, teach our students more grammar. So today I'm going to share with you at least 5 beliefs and practices that I think we need to relook very carefully. And these are the 5 things that I'm going to share with you. Number 1, to do with grammar. Number 2, to do with vocabulary. The next one, to do with how we choose text for teaching purposes. Number 4, the role of strategies in language learning, in language development. And number 5, a classic issue of whether and to what extent we want to help our students to develop native-like fluency in their language learning process. Let me begin the first one, grammar. When students can't speak well, the response is very often, teach them more grammar. When they can't write very well, and very often the response again is the same, teach them more grammar. When they don't like English lessons, Tanbir, teach them more grammar. It's a very classic response. And when they don't do well on examinations, teach them more grammar. I think there's something here that we need to really rethink about our typical responses that we often hear from people, from experts, from policymakers and all that. I have nothing against grammar, but we need to be very careful about the kind of grammar that we are teaching our students. Let me summarize what I know about grammar in relation to the process of language learning. There are 2 types basically. Number 1 is explicit grammar knowledge. And this number 1 is, I think, a major issue because we often spend way too much time focusing on explicit grammar knowledge, telling the students, explaining to the students all the wonderful grammatical rules and discourse rules to our students, hoping that one day they'll be able to make use of this grammar that they have learned explicitly in the classroom. I don't think that should be the way to go. Yeah, so my response to that is, yes, we can teach a little bit of this, but let's do less of this, not more. I don't think more is the answer. I think we should do less of the teaching of this type of grammar. I would suggest that we focus more on the number 2, teaching implicit knowledge of the grammar of the language. Now, this is the kind of grammar that is usually acquired quite incidentally when students are immersed in meaning-making activities, in comprehension, in meaningful activities, usually through being exposed to a lot of reading and a lot of listening. I think we should do a lot more of number 2. Ladies and gentlemen, let me say this again, grammar is important, but the kind of grammar that we need to focus more on is the number 2, implicit grammar of the language. If you're looking for something to help you become more convinced, now here is a quote from a second language researcher or second language acquisition researcher. Yeah, and let me read to you very carefully the ability. If that is our goal in language learning, in language teaching, if our goal is to help the students to become able to produce language communicatively for various purposes, I think we need to develop this implicit knowledge because your ability to speak and to write draws heavily. Now, the key word is heavily on implicit knowledge, not on explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge comes a bit later when you are monitoring your performance, when you are looking at your written product maybe, and then when you make changes because you find some mistakes somewhere there. So that would be number 1. Yeah, grammar. I don't think we should be teaching more grammar. I think we should be teaching less of the kind of grammar that we normally teach in the classroom. Number 2, ladies and gentlemen, is vocabulary. Now, for some reason, vocabulary, when you ask people about vocabulary, they will all say, yes, it's very important. But in reality, when you walk into the classroom, grammar is very often neglected. Vocabulary is very often neglected to the extent that we have the feeling that people may think, or many teachers think, that words are not that important. It's often neglected in favor of grammar. And when it is taught, it's very taught, in a very decontextualized manner. And the focus also is on basic, superficial dictionary meaning. Very little focus on the pragmatic meaning of words in context. And that, I think, is a bad thing, because it is the last point that is very important for the students to learn. When words are used in rich, meaningful context, chances are higher that the students may be able to use this kind of words later for meaningful communication, for speaking, and also for writing. Now, here's what I've learned from the research literature. There's a very strong correlation between vocabulary and language skills. I think we need to keep saying this until teachers actually believe that this is perhaps one, or if not the most important things that the students need to learn. The ability to speak, your ability to write, the ability to understand language depends very, very heavily on the number of words that you know. Yeah, now here's again a quote from Alderson, a testing specialist. Language ability is to quite a large extent a function of vocabulary size. The more words you know, the better. I think that is what the what research is telling us. Let me share with you, this is a very complex study that I saw recently, published recently in Language Learning. Language Learning is one of those big journals in our field that publish only very, very complex type of study. Now, the researcher here is interested in understanding the relationship between listening comprehension, so that is the dependent measure, and a whole bunch of variables, including this. A whole bunch of cognitive strategies, processing capacity, metacognitive abilities, and many other factors that have been shown to be related to students' ability to comprehend spoken text. The finding is very interesting. Look at this. Yes, all these things are related to in some way, but the most powerful, the most important variables, only two. Number one is topic, whether or not you're familiar with the topic of the listening materials. And number two, whether or not you have sufficient vocabulary. And of these two, which one is more important? I think the figure is quite small there. Vocabulary is the most important, the most critical, the most powerful predictor of students' comprehension. I think you can extend the finding here to other aspects, other areas of language learning, like reading comprehension, for example. I will not be surprised if students' comprehension also depends very heavily on these two things, their knowledge of the words and also their knowledge of the world. Again, this is what we know from research. For communication, for social purposes, for writing email messages, for having a social conversation, for example, I think students need about 2,000 words. For reading non-technical text, for writing non-technical text, about 5,000 more or less. And roughly about 8,000 words if you want to engage in more complex language processing, like writing academic text or reading highly technical text, for example. In other words, we know that size is important, but research also tells us that the quality of the words that you learn is also very important. Quality here refers to the depth of your vocabulary knowledge, how well you know those words. Can you use those words for speaking? Can you use those words for writing? Can you use those words in informal situations, in formal situations, and all that? So that refers to the quality. And quality, again, is very often neglected in the teaching of vocabulary. Number two. Now, number three, getting there. Altogether, I have 5, yeah? So keep counting. We are into number 3 now. 3 more to go. Text. This refers to teaching materials. Teaching materials. Remember, when it comes to selecting teaching materials for our students, reading passages or listening passages, keep in mind that content is the most important consideration. There you go. I still remember this quote from many years ago: in the absence of interesting and emotionally appealing text, very little is possible. I think if you've been teaching for a while in school, I think you understand why students are not interested in your reading lesson, in your language or English lessons, because the materials are not interesting. the materials are not emotionally engaging. Yeah. Again, research tells us very clearly that when materials are engaging emotionally and cognitively, chances are higher that the students will be more willing to spend more cognitive effort into the learning process. So that is one aspect of the materials. Number one is the content. Number two, equally important, because we are dealing with students of different ability level. They're still developing their language proficiency. I think we need to take a look at this very, very closely. Essentially, there are three different types of materials. Number one, materials at the student's comfort zone. They can read independently without any problem. Number two, materials at the student's stretch zone, also known as their learning zone, within their proximal zone of proximal development. And number three is the panic zone. You should not be using text of number three. Panic means it's just way too difficult. Yeah. Tanbir, can I ask you a question? Which one is best for language learning? Tricky question, yeah. Please don't say number three. Number three is a bad answer. So choose either number one or number two. Please say number two.
I would say a mixture of comfort and stretch.
I like that. I like that. Yes. Yes. I think Tanbir is a very smart teacher. Okay. Now, the middle one, the stretch zone. This is what happens. And because of this, a lot of teachers fall in love with this type of materials. The text must contain new vocabulary. The text must contain new grammar. The text must present new contents. Why? That's what you do in the classroom. You need to present new things. Otherwise, you won't have anything new to teach to your students, yeah? So Tanbir is right. Yes, we should be using this type of materials. But I think we should not neglect the use of the first type of materials, comfort zone materials, easy, familiar text. They serve very important purpose, not no purpose in language learning. Now, here is what I've learned from the research literature. Yeah, easier texts are wonderful texts. Number one, I think we know from research, from theory of language learning, that comprehensible input is critically important in language learning. Comprehensible means easy, means accessible. It's within the student's level. Number two, another important point, it is a great source of implicit grammar. If you teach new things all the time, students will not be able to be exposed to, familiar language, familiar grammatical structures that they are more likely to acquire during that process. It's also a great source of deeper vocabulary knowledge. Remember what I said earlier on about quality of vocabulary, yeah? So easy text is a great source of that kind of knowledge because you get to see how the words are used in different contexts, but always in familiar language. And that is when language acquisition takes place wonderfully. And the last one, I think you know this. Learning requires a lot of consolidation. Learning requires a lot of restructuring as well. And that is only possible when the students are seeing easy, accessible materials on a regular basis. Number four, Aslam. Number four, my favorite topic, learning strategies, yeah? Strategy is like a magic bullet for language learning. I think we should rethink, our belief about learning strategies. Now, here are some of the reasons. Number one, good language learners use a lot of strategies. Yes, I think we have seen that. It's been reported in the literature. Number two, poor language learners, those who are not very proficient, they don't use a lot of learning strategies. And research also tells us very clearly, Aslam, please say yes, positive associations between strategy use and proficiency. Yes, I've seen that a lot.
Yes.
So much so that, strategy researchers or strategy scholars have this piece of advice. Read this very carefully. This is like, wow, strategies is a magic bullet. They just teach your students strategies and they will do wonderful things. Look at this. Learners' tool for active, conscious, purposeful, attentive learning, and they pave the way toward greater proficiency, learner autonomy, self-regulation, almost everything under the sun, basically. I think we need to think about this very carefully. I don't think it is justifiable to make such a big claim. Yeah.
Dr. William, just a gentle reminder. There's two more minutes left. Thank you.
Very good. I'm almost there. Okay, here's my take on learning strategies. Yes, there's a lot of correlation, but I think we also know that correlation is not causation. The fact that two things are related from a correlational point of view doesn't mean that one is causing the other to happen. Yeah. In other words, number one, number two, strategies that we have seen may not be causing higher proficiency in our students. May not be the case. We don't know. Because it is also possible that it is when the students are at the higher level of proficiency, then they are able to use all these wonderful strategies. I am more inclined to interpret the research in relation to number three, that it is when the students are already at the higher level of proficiency that they can, produce, they can use, they can deploy a lot more strategies. Yeah. So my take again is it okay then to teach listening strategies? The answer is yes, it is okay. Tanbir, please say yes. Yes, it is okay. But, go easy on it. Go easy. That's a key word. Training or strategy training is no replacement to basic language learning processes. I don't think that should be the case. Now, here is again a quote. You always need somebody to back you up. Yeah. Now, Daniel Willingham here is a cognitive scientist, somebody who studies the brain, how our mind processes information and all that. And he has written a lot about reading, the processes of reading. And this is what he says. Yeah. Teaching reading strategies is a low-cost way to give developing readers a boost, but it should be a small part of a teacher's job. So I'm very, very surprised very often when I speak to a teacher who teaches reading or listening, and then the whole syllabus is organized around teaching students a whole bunch of strategies like predicting strategy, skimming strategies, scanning strategies, and all the other wonderful strategies. I don't think that should be the way to go. And again, this is what he said, which is what I said earlier on. Acquiring a broad vocabulary and a rich base of background knowledge will yield more substantial and longer-term benefits. Last one, Tanbir, give me 2 minutes, yeah? Okay. Native-like fluency is a gold standard. Not anymore. 30 years ago, it might be the case, but nowadays it should not be the case anymore. Point number one that I want to make and I want to share with you is this: native-like fluency is neither desirable nor achievable. I think that's a bit tricky. Desirable means if you look at me, for example, I don't want to speak like somebody from the US or from New Zealand, for example, my friend Jonathan Newton. I don't want to speak like them. Why? Because I am who I am. I want to speak the way I do, because that will show my nationality, my identity, my professionalism. So I don't think I want to, or we should, get our students to speak like native speakers of the language. And number two, from second language acquisition research, we know that it is not achievable. Not achievable. If you learn English in Korea, for example, if you learn English in Japan, in Malaysia, in Thailand, I don't think you will ever be able to get there, because of the quantity and the quality of language input is completely different. Plus, nowadays, English is an international language. Even native speakers now, this is interesting. Aslam, if you're looking for a job, like me, I will be looking for a job soon, teaching native speakers how to speak like you and me. Isn't that wonderful? This is happening, seriously. Big companies are spending money actually teaching or asking their directors to learn how to speak and understand people from different parts of the world who happen to be speaking the language. Yeah. So the standards now in relation to English as an international language is number one. Number one, when you speak, you have to be linguistically comprehensible, that people understand you. Number two, more important, I think Jonathan is probably going to talk about this, socially and culturally acceptable as well. So the notion behind intercultural competence. When I speak to Aslam, I need to understand where he's coming from so that he will, he will welcome me to Malaysia and buy me dinner and all the wonderful stuff. I can't just speak, suka-suka the way I like. I have to understand him very well, understand the culture. And point number 3, I think it's perfectly okay for people to be bilingually and multilingually competent. And I can see that a lot of people in the audience are just people who are bilingually and multilingually competent. There's nothing wrong with that. So this is no longer a relevant question. Yeah, learning to speak from native speakers or learning to speak from non-native speakers is no longer a relevant question. I think we need to throw away this idea. Instead, we should be looking at this, whether your teacher is good, whether your teacher is effective or not effective. Yeah, if your teacher is not effective, you should hire a more effective teacher. Native or non-native doesn't matter, really. That's the end of my presentation, ladies and gentlemen. Again, 5 points. Number 1, we need to rethink very carefully the beliefs and practices that we've been, keeping us back, if you like, in terms of grammar, vocabulary, in terms of choice of text, in terms of the teaching of strategies, and in terms of trying to get our students to speak like native speakers. My slides are available here. Feel free to download my slides. The QR code is there. It's completely free if you download it before the end of today. Back to you, Tanbir. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Willie, for your informative presentation. Dr. Willie shared with us his thoughts on some widely held but unsound beliefs and practices that we need to unlearn. For example, the younger, the better. Bilingual teachers are not as good as monolingual teachers. Grammar is more important than vocabulary, and replace this with ones that reflect current thinking in ELT, such as less explicit grammar teaching and more of acquiring implicit grammar knowledge, selecting new and emotionally engaging texts, and many more tips. Thank you so much once again, Dr.